morning and welcome and thank you for attending. My name is Ed Joyce and I'm the president of the Delaware Valley chapter of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Tonight we have a very distinguished speaker. However, before I introduce Fred, I want to take a few minutes here to tell you about Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. I see a number of faces that I have never seen before, so I'm assuming that you don't know a whole lot about our organization. Americans United was founded way back in the middle of the 20th century by a coalition of educators, religious leaders, and church leaders for the sole purpose of guaranteeing everyone their constitutional right to practice the religion of their choice or refrain from practicing as their conscience dictates. I think our message is pretty simple. You can distill it down to just a few words, and that is we ask government to remain neutral with respect to religion. It's kind of my mantra, and it says it all in just a few words. What that means is we would like government not to inhibit religion, religious organizations, as well as we don't want government to promote religion. Just remain neutral. Sounds like a simple task, but to get legislators and government officials to recognize that is a real challenge. Another thing I want to make very clear is that we are not anti-religion. Barry Lynn, our executive director, is an ordained minister. The Delaware Valley chapter has a clergy advisory board composed of 5 local clergy members that advise us and help us out with religious issues. And if you know any of our members represent a broad cross-section of religious beliefs as well as non-believers as well. So we are in no way an anti-religious group. The Delaware Valley chapter has two goals. We educate and we act as constitutional eyes and ears. Constitutionally, we're kind of the boots on the ground locally, so if someone has an issue, typically they would come to us and we would help them out, and if the issue is too challenging, then we direct them to our national office. And what, Janice?
You know, we just had a victory with the Noah's Ark in the park.
We had a victory with Noah's Ark in the park in Delaware. So we address local issues. We're the go-to group for local issues. Educationally, we hold regular meetings like this. We hold a symposia about every year and a half where we get speakers from literally from across the country to come and speak, constitutional attorneys, scholars, historians. We do pretty much anything we can to educate the public about the importance of maintaining a healthy separation between church and state. Are there any questions or comments or general issues before I introduce our speaker? Yes?
I want to make one comment because
sure.
I've met Janet before. I was attended a few meetings of the Cherry Hill group that meets for AU, and one of the things I questioned, because if I had seen your pamphlet without any conversation with anyone belonging to the group, I would have thought you were a religious group.
A religious group?
Correct. Because it says Americans United and then it says for religious freedom. I like religious neutrality better, and I think that tells more what you are.
Yeah, good point. But yeah, I think probably religious freedom is probably more encompassing.
As an atheist, I would never have attended a meeting if I had seen that alone. I'm just letting you know my feeling.
Yeah, that's good input. I can see your point.
Yeah, but I like religious neutrality. That's a very good term.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Without any further, yes.
Where can I get a copy of this book locally?
Amazon. Yeah, Amazon.
Have to go
Unfortunately, we're not allowed to sell books here, or else I'm sure Fred would have brought.
Yes, Mr.
Yeah.
Rich explained so.
I'm sorry?
They sell them downstairs?
No.
Sure they do.
Yes, they do. They're
Absolutely.
selling them not his books, other people's books.
Oh, yeah. And I think the reason they probably don't want us selling books to compete with their selling downstairs. They've never told me why we can't sell books. They just said we can't sell books.
we sell the book. Whenever an author is in town, we always sell the book there.
The library
Sounds
does,
like
but we're not the
discrimination
library,
to
we're a
me.
separate group.
No, they're not being neutral.
I imagine the
No,
library.
the library's not being neutral. Okay, our speaker tonight is Fred Rich. He has come all the way from Manhattan. Fred is a Wall Street lawyer and author. His alarm at the Theocratic program of the so-called Christian nation movement caused him to write a political novel animated by McCain Palin winning in 2008, and then Palin becoming president upon McCain's death. Sounds more like a horror story. Compared by critics to St. Clair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, Fred's novel challenges us to take seriously those who seek to demolish the separation between church and state, and paints a scary picture of what the country they seek would look like. Fred.
All right, thank you. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out on a pretty foul night. I should say, first of all, that those of you who are members of AU, I really want to say thank you and congratulations. I mean, as a lawyer, you may have no idea how unequal the playing field is. The Christian right has hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on lawyers every year. They bring lawsuits all over the country attacking them. And on the other side of those lawsuits, defending separation of church and state are really only two organizations, the American Civil Liberties Union and Americans United for Church and State. And if they weren't there, there'd be basically nobody playing defense. So it's a terrific organization. It really is religious neutrality, even though some of the leaders are ministers. So it's a great organization, and I'm delighted you all are members. So here's the plan for tonight. I want to leave tons of time for discussion because this audience, I can already tell, has opinions on what I'm going to talk about. And so I think the discussion is bound to be lively. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by showing you the teaser video for the book. I, as an author, was very surprised to find, I thought my audience were readers, not 20-somethings who would only look at a video screen. But no, I was told you have to have a video. So this is the video teaser for the book, which is intended to raise a lot more questions than it answers. Let's see if this warms up. Okay.
The year is 2029. For the past 5 years, the United States has been a Christian nation. A man I hardly know has seated me in front of a typewriter and told me to remember and write. I don't know why I'm here or what they really want from me. The cloak of collective righteousness lies heavy on the land.
After the Christian majority takes control, pluralism will be seen as immoral and evil, and the state will not permit anybody the right to practice evil.
Half the nation was disappointed when the dream of an Obama presidency died.
We say, praise my God, in the name of Jesus. Every form of witchcraft is what you are rebuke, and in the name of Jesus.
Greg, think about this. What happened? Why did it happen? How could it have happened?
Spiritual warriors who will say, America will not fall. That we will not let this nation fall to the hands of those who would enslave us.
Ladies and gentlemen, America belongs to God.
America started as a Christian nation. It didn't start as a heathen nation. It belongs to Jesus Christ. It's his. It's his country.
I suppose what happened was, they said what they would do, we didn't listen, and they did what they said they would do. On July 24th, 2012, President Palin, for only the second time in the history of the Republic, declared martial law. We draw the line at Manhattan. The 1.7 million New Yorkers who live here will fight you. We will fight you in every neighborhood, every street, every alley, and every building. We will fight you because we fight for our freedom. We fight for our dignity. We fight for our lives.
So you get the you get the message that this book is not boring, and it's filled with action. So let me do this. I'm going to tell you what this book is about. We're then going to talk a little bit about what is religious fundamentalism, because that's what the book is about, Christian fundamentalism in this case. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Christian nation movement. Many of you might not know about it. Why, and then why I did this as a novel. Why is this a novel and not something different? And that's the agenda. And then let's have a discussion. I also want to start out, by saying what this book is not. This book. I just should say, full disclosure. I mean, I'm an atheist. I'm a committed, militant atheist. But this book is not Richard Dawkins, in your face, the problem with the world is religion. It's not. Because my audience and our audience for separation of church and state has to be the nation as we find it. And the nation as we find it is filled with religious people who are not evil. So this is not an in-your-face anti-religious book. In fact, if you look at the back cover, this gentleman has the book, you'll see that 3 of the 5 blurbs in the back of the book are from ministers. Why is that? Because who is threatened most by Christian fundamentalism? Mainstream Christianity.
Yeah.
Look at what fundamentalism did to Islam. It destroyed Islam. It's on its way to destroying Islam as a religion. So there are a lot of, moderate, mainstream Protestant religious leaders who understand that. The other thing is that the book is not partisan either. I mean, I'm no fan of Sarah Palin, but again, this is not a partisan issue. I think the rise of Christian fundamentalism is not a Democrat versus Republican thing. And again, if you look on the back cover of the book, you'll see the Republican head of the Federal Election Commission, blurb the book. He was McCain's general counsel in the McCain campaign. A lot of mainstream Republicans also understand that they did a deal with the devil and are very, very worried about it. Okay, so this book is not anti-religious. It is not partisan. So what is it? As you saw from the video, it's written as a memoir. That narrator who sits in front of the desk in front of the typewriter, which by the way is off the grid. The grid is called the Purity Web, and it's an instrument of authoritarian control in the Christian nation. And he looks backwards and tells the story from the mid 2000s forward through a personal memoir. The device that I used in this book was not to make anything up. Everything in the book that happens before the night of election night 2008 is absolutely true. Everything that every politician says, everything that's done in Congress is absolutely true. And then you have what's called a counterfactual or a pivot point. Right? This is, I don't know how many of you read Philip Roth's Plot Against America. He used the pivot point, the election of 1940, and then asked what would have happened if Lindbergh had won instead of Roosevelt. So it then takes that pivot point, and then the rest of it is what they call speculative fiction. But I have to say something, as you saw from that video, where it was all the Christian leaders, speaking their own words. Again, I didn't make it up. Everything that the Christian leadership does, that Sarah Palin does and her successor does, has its roots in either something that they already tried to do before 2008 or something that they said they would do. So you have to bear this in mind. At least this gentleman is going to read the book. When you read all the really bad stuff that happens, remember, I didn't make any of this up. Everything that was done is something that leaders of the Christian right said they would do if they acquired power. One of the things that I do in this book is play with the difference between what a theocratic future looks like and how you get there. How many people here have read Margaret Atwood? Of course. Now, The Handmaid's Tale is a brilliant, brilliant book. It paints a very scary dystopian future, but that weird dystopian future just sits out there, and nothing in Margaret Atwood's book tells you how you get there. So even though we're all scared by it in a visceral way, it's not like you put down the book and say, oh, I can see how that could happen. And for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a very extreme Christian-dominated future, particularly with respect to the role of women, and women have lost, well, I won't go into it, but it's a very weird future. But you're not so worried about it when you finish that book because there's no connection to today. So to get people to take seriously the threat of Christian fundamentalism and the theocratic agenda of the Christian right, what I figured I needed to do is paint a path, a very gradual and incremental path that was credible. So what did I start with? Notice it's not Michelle Bachmann or one of the nutcases getting elected, right? Because you would say, that had never happened. And I think you're right. I don't think Michelle Bachmann would ever win an election. But what did happen? McCain nominated Sarah Palin to be his vice president. That happened. Nobody had to make that up. And what could have happened on election night 2008? McCain could have won easily. Easily. That could happen. He's a 70-year-old man. In the book, he drops dead of a brain aneurysm while giving a speech in Moscow in early 2009. That could have happened. Right? So what my book does is, yes, by the end you get to a Margaret Atwood-like theocratic future, but my intention is that at the end of every chapter, and it's chronological, you say, well, that could have happened. And then you get to the next chapter and you say, well, that could have happened, and so on and so forth. And before long, you're in a very bad place, and you're really worried about it because you can see how it could have happened. So that is really the function of dystopian fiction. We'll talk more about that. So I said that the enemy here is not religion in this book. It's not Republicans generically. It's fundamentalism, and I think it's really interesting to stop and ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? That's a word that is thrown around a lot, right? I did a lot of research for this book, and what I'm about to tell you about fundamentalism is really, there's some seats up here, it really represents a kind of scholarly consensus. And this is, by the way, let me say, across all religions. This is answering the question, if it's Hindu fundamentalism, which is a huge problem in India, if it's Islamic fundamentalism, Mormons have their own fundamentalist wing. I don't know how many have read Krakauer. So this goes across. This isn't a definition of just what Christian fundamentalism is. This is what fundamentalism is across all of these different religions. The first, there are basically four main criteria. The first is that fundamentalists claim to speak to and for God and tell the rest of us what God wants. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, I don't know how many of you ever watch Christian broadcasting. I don't know how many of you actually listen to the campaign speeches by Rick Perry and Mike Huckabee and Sarah Palin and all the rest of them. But just Google their name and God wants in quotes, and you'll find, 10,000 hits. Their speech is sprinkled with what God wants. what is God's plan, right? These are people, these individuals were people who have absolutely no problem claiming to speak for an omnipotent God. But this, of course, alone does not make a fundamentalist, because there's a lot of casual speech among religious people about what God wants. The second thing, and the second fundamental thing of fundamentalism, is intolerance of non-believers, right? We're, most of the people here, if assuming that most of you are kind of secular and liberal and the vision of whether it's religious neutrality or religious freedom, what is the core value? It's tolerance, okay? One of the great lessons of history is that the one thing we should never tolerate is intolerance. The other side of the coin on intolerance among fundamentalists is that if they don't have their way, they see themselves as the victim. The language of victimization, and this is why all those references to religious freedom become so twisted, because in the language of the Christian right, the sort of secularism and separation of church and state which AU advocates victimizes believers. And it's hard to get your head around. I mean, I see people looking, how does that work? I'm telling you, that's the language, that's the view. This came out in the marriage equality debate. If you listen to that rhetoric, what was it? It didn't say we shouldn't let, it was characterized as a war on marriage, right? Extending equal rights to gays was a war on marriage in which religious people were the victims. Right? That was the language. And here in Pennsylvania, I'm sure many people in this room remember this, but on the floor of the Pennsylvania Assembly, and this is a wonderful illustration, there was a legislator called Darrell Metcalf, who was a great hero to the Christian right, and he succeeded in denying a platform to a fellow legislator who wanted to, a legislator who wished to make a speech in favor of marriage equality in Pennsylvania. So we're not saying that he just disagreed with him. He succeeded in your Commonwealth? Commonwealth. In your Commonwealth. And this is what he said on the floor of the Assembly. I do not believe that as a member of that body, I should allow someone to make comments such as he was preparing to make, that ultimately were just open rebellion against what the Word of God has said, what God wants. It was just open rebellion against God's law. So if you're in open rebellion against God and you're a fundamentalist, there's no tolerating that, i.e. the speech by the rest of us who are non-believers is intolerable because that speech makes them victims. Sir, did you
He was trying to stop the representative actually for this district.
He was?
Yeah, Brian Sims. He represents this district that we're in right now.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Could you repeat what he just said?
Yeah.
The gentleman said that the man who made this statement was competing for the seat for this district.
Representative Brian
He
Sims.
was trying to stop Brian Sims, who
Oh,
represents this district, from
speaking.
Yeah, he was the one he was trying to stop.
Fascinating.
Brian Sims represents this district.
Fascinating. I mean, this was a real wake-up call for the rest of the country, because this is not South Carolina, but, well, we can talk about Pennsylvania later. So, second characteristic, intolerance of non-believers and seeing themselves as victims. The third characteristic of fundamentalists is disdain for intellectual inquiry and working to abolish or control education. Right? Now you see this again. Every one of these characteristics goes across whether you're Hindus, Islam, or whatever else. And in fact, I mean, it's very, actually this piece is sort of understood in terms of Pakistan with the madrasas, but I don't know how many of you have been following what's happened in Nigeria, and there's all the talk about the Boko Haram, the people who kidnap the young girls. Does anybody know what Boko Haram actually means?
Western education is evil.
It literally means education is prohibited. Boko Haram means education is prohibited, but of course the education is prohibited is anything other than the teaching of the Quran and Islam. So, what do we see here? I mean, so we all think, oh my God, that's Nigeria, it's a mess. All right, here we had Pat Robertson, who was a candidate for president, who said he longed for the day when public education was abolished and education will again be entrusted exclusively to the churches. We have about 1 or 2 million children in America that receive homeschooling with an exclusively evangelical slant. And about 15% of all private school students are in evangelical Christian academies. Now, 1 or 2 million as a percentage of our population is higher than the percentage of Pakistani kids who are in madrasas. And the hostility, the deep hostility to secular education in this country, you see it over and over again in the fights about curriculum, about creationism, about school books. Education and the control of education and the control of the next generation is always at the top of the fundamentalist agenda. This is no different. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question. That's not historical, is it? I mean, wasn't education always in America somewhat secular? Way
No.
back to the beginning? I mean,
No, actually, it's interesting, and we're going to talk about history because the control of history is at the very core of this debate. And I think the difference is we've always had religious education, right? Catholic school systems, educated a lot of our immigrants in the early days of the Republic. Think of all our great universities, maybe not here in nice secular Philadelphia where we had Quakers, right? But the great universities were almost all sponsored by religious denominations and so forth. The difference is the characteristic of this evangelical education is very different. I'll just give you an example. The leading high school textbook that is used both in the evangelical Christian academies and in homeschooling. Right? This is high school level U.S. history. Right? The first line of that, the first sentence in that textbook is the following: "Who can doubt that America was an idea in the mind of God for all eternity?" Right? That's the first sentence in the history textbook that's used by these people. So if you think you understand what American exceptionalism means, if you're starting to get a little hint as to what the Christian nation idea is, there's a lot of hint of it in that sentence, right? And when we hear all the talking heads in Washington say, oh, American exceptionalism, it just means, we have to have power and we're America. That's not what American exceptionalism means in the evangelical world. And the fourth characteristic of fundamentalism is the longing for political power. And the observation historically is that what fundamentalists do is they take advantage of economic distress and social anxiety to make the leap from being a fringe belief into the center of political power. Fundamentalism always starts on the fringe, as it was here, right? I mean, if we were having this discussion 25 years ago, this way of thinking, what I'm going to describe to you about the Christian nation idea, they would have been cranks. Right? And if I had stood up and said, we really want to take these people seriously, I would have been a crank. Right? Fundamentalism always starts on the fringes. And it does not escape from the fringes into the heart of political life until you have some trauma that's suffered by the society, akin to the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. All you have to do is look at what the conditions were for that kind of fringe thinking to leap into the center. And that's why in the video you might have noticed two things. Because Palin takes over in 2008, there's no fiscal stimulus. They do nothing about the Great Recession. The Great Recession turns into a Great Depression. You have, deep, deep economic pain in this country. And then the crashing planes were a second terrorist attack. And so the proposition in my book is that a prolonged decade of a second Great Depression plus the trauma of a second terrorist attack are really sufficient. And in fact, it's what, Sarah Palin her first term is a disaster in the book, and I won't tell you too much since I hope some of you read it, but she's really going to be a one-term president, and then the second terrorist attack hits. So that is what fundamentalism is, and I just ask you to think a little bit about what that's not. You know, it's not the problem, in my view, and the problem in the book that is carried forward is not one of general religiosity. I mean, the country has always been remarkably religious, and I mean, those of us, you know, if you're an atheist, you know, you do think that general religiosity is something that has to be transcended, but this narrow political problem that I'm talking about is not one of general religiosity. It's not really even the evangelical movement itself, because this country has always had waves of religious enthusiasm. If you're students of history and you know about the 19th century, you know, we had waves of evangelical fervor that then burned itself out. And in fact, really, even the kind of cultural war agenda itself isn't the root of the problem, because we've always had an argument in this country to the extent to which you should legislate morality. I mean, we've been legislating morality since the 17th century. We've always had an argument about that. And, you know, our democracy has survived all those things. Our democracy survived general religiosity. Our democracy survived evangelical fervor. Our democracy survived the desire to, you know, try to legislate some morality. The problem is the political agenda, which is what Christian nationalism is. That's why the book is called Christian Nation. And by the way, there's a wonderful thing, and you know, it's at this point in the speech where everybody starts to look really depressed, and I start to feel guilty because what a downer. Right? So I'm sorry. It is a downer, but it's going to get worse. There's an expression that political analysts use: dog whistle politics. Does anybody know what that means?
No.
You can probably figure it out.
Yeah.
Like when they use certain terms that only religious people would understand.
Exactly. So, because remember, when you're trying to reach in a national audience and using, you know, broad media, it's fine when you're in Christian broadcasting, which, by the way, has, you know, 200 million viewers every day. You people never see it. But when they have to be in the general media, they can't really say what they mean, because they would, you know, tip off the rest of us. And so it's called dog whistle politics. So, in fact, one of the things that first put me onto this, it was in the 2008 campaign, and you know how you get all those pieces of direct mail from the various candidates, and because I've given money to both Democrats and Republicans, I seem to be on every single list, right? And I got this envelope, and it was from the Newt Gingrich campaign, and it said on the front of the envelope, "Barack Obama says America is not a Christian nation." And I thought, well, that's peculiar. I mean, why would you put that on the front of an envelope? And what does that mean anyway? I mean, yeah, America is a Christian nation, and that it's been the prevailing, you know, in the same way I'd say France is a Catholic country, and Argentina is a Catholic country, and, you know, Japan is Shinto or whatever. Sure, the main religion in this country has been Christianity. So why would you say that? Well, of course, the reason is that Christian nation has nothing to do with the sort of empirical description of what is the religious tradition, right, of this country. Christian nation is one of those terms that has a very distinct meaning, and it is basically the code word for Christian nationalism. And to understand Christian nationalism, which is the political program, you have to understand three things: the theological basis, the how they're trying to seize control of history, and then the political process, which really has it as its heart the dismantling of the separation of church and state. So let me just briefly, and I'll try not to get bogged down in the theology, because, you know, it's pretty crazy. But I'm sure have you all heard of dominionism and reconstructionism? People kind of know generally what those two things are. You've got to remember, this is, you know, Sarah Palin's church in Wasilla, Alaska, that thing where she was having a kind of little exorcism. This was in the campaign, by the way. This is in the middle of the campaign. One of these priests came to help her get elected by driving out what was he, witchcraft? I don't know. There, oh, yeah, she thought that people were using witchcraft against her. Anyway,
What's Dominionism? I don't know.
okay, yeah, sorry, I'll explain very briefly. There are two different things. Dominionism is the idea that the destiny of America is to be God's kingdom on earth, the shining city on the hill, talked about in the Bible. You know how Ronald Reagan used to always love to talk about the shining city upon the hill. I think Ronald Reagan meant it in a kind of general metaphorical sense. They don't mean it in a general metaphorical sense. The shining city upon the hill means that the establishment of God's kingdom on earth is a predicate for the second coming of Christ and the rapture. Now, if you're an evangelical, which, by the way, 70 to 80 million of your fellow citizens believe this, the most important thing that will ever happen in the universe, and certainly the most important thing that will ever happen in their lives, is the second coming of Christ. So when something is a condition for the second coming of Christ, you are highly motivated to satisfy that condition. So dominionism, to have the godly kingdom on earth, it's sort of realizing Americans' destiny, but it requires Christians to have dominion over every aspect of life. And if you're in this world, there's something called the Seven Mountains movement, which is to separately attack each of the 7 areas of civic and political life to establish Christian dominion. It's business, government, media, arts and entertainment, education, family, and religion. All of those things must be controlled by Christians in order for the second coming of Christ to occur. So that's kind of the idea of dominionism, that it's the idea of Christian dominion over the second, as a condition of the second coming. The Reconstructionism is the sort of flip side of the coin, which is once you have dominion over political life, you have to reconstruct political life strictly in accordance with the lessons of the Bible, the teaching of the Bible. And what's very interesting about this type of Christian evangelicalism, it's very focused on the Old Testament. One of the things I do in my book is, again, apology to the atheists, but I happen to think that Christianity has a lot of really interesting, important ethical teachings. Turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, forgiveness of sins. It's a pretty radical, in the scheme of human history, it's a pretty radical set of ethical teaching, which is pretty terrific. And don't you ever wonder when you see these political active Christians say, all they talk about is who they hate? Mm-hmm. We got to kick out the immigrant kids, and we got to, we hate gay people, and we hate these, and we hate this. And I'm sitting there, that's not what I learned that Christianity was about. I learned that Christianity was about love. Well, no, they're very focused on the Old Testament. There's a guy called J.R. Rushdoony, who wrote the Institutes of Biblical Law, which is kind of their Bible. Shouldn't be much of a surprise because, as I said, in all of these other types of fundamentalism, of course, they rest on literal reading of the religious text, and they believe in the literal application of Old Testament law and seek to reformulate political life to be strictly, it's just like Sharia. It's no different. We just don't have a word for it, right? Sharia is, a religious law in the civic sphere. This is what Reconstructionism is. So these are the two theological engines behind the Christian nation movement. The other engine is taking control of history. And anybody here who's studied revolution, how do we, when you want to change a society, what's the first thing you do? No, you try to seize control of the history. You have to seize control of the history, and you have to rewrite the history, in a way that lays the foundation for what you want to do. Now, the evangelical movement and the Tea Party movement have now kind of come together. The political commentators have started to refer to them as T-evangelicals. And, if you ever kind of wondered, you look at TV and it's some Tea Party, and all these people are dressed up. They're all dressed up as militiamen and founding fathers, and they're toting rifles, and they have on funny hats, and it's this preoccupation with history. Well, this is a very, very serious thing. I'm sure many of you know about David Barton. Do you know who David Barton is? David Barton is a pseudo-historian. And I say that he has no academic credentials. He is reviled and he's a subject of just derision by any serious historians. In fact, finally, the mainstream media has really started to attack him and lose his credibility. But unfortunately, he's already done the work because he's provided this pseudo-historical basis for the Christian nation movement. David Barton travels around the country and basically says that this country had theocratic origins, that the Puritans, in coming to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, came to establish the godly kingdom, which that much is true. They twist and pervert. You know how you can deal with quotes. I mean, you can take any founding father and you can sit with the 5 volumes of their letters, and of course, are you going to find references to Christ and God? And well, of course you are. It was the 18th century. Everybody was religious, right? But it didn't obscure them. What they attempt to obscure is the fundamental fact that we all have to keep focused on, which is that our Constitution is a product of the Enlightenment. America is an Enlightenment project. It's not a theocratic project, and that is, if you don't look at every quote that mentions God and you look at the bigger picture of what the founding fathers had in mind, that's pretty clear. It is an extraordinary fact that the word God is not mentioned in our Constitution. Now, this is a little bit like climate denial. If I was in Kansas and I gave this speech and said the word God is not mentioned in the Constitution of the United States of America, they would say, that's impossible. That can't be. And if I took it out and I opened it up, they'd say, well, that's a wrong copy. Right? I mean, it's just one of these things that, it's like, Obama being not born in America, or, climate change not existing. But the fact is that God is not mentioned in the Constitution. And in fact, all the God stuff that crept into our civil life was not from the 18th century, it was modern. God was added to the currency in 1863, after the Civil War. The whole, in God you trust thing wasn't on the currency until after the Civil War.
That's coins.
Sorry?
The currency wasn't until the 1950s.
Okay, was that coins? Yes, sorry, exactly. Postage stamps was 1912. No God on the postage stamps until 1912. The Pledge of Allegiance, the words under God, added in the 1950s. 1950s, right. So, so this is what I mean about taking control of history. Those 70 or 80 million evangelicals believe firmly that their vision of American life is completely rooted in the vision of the Founding Fathers. It was the intention of the Founders, and that's why, in fact, in the Supreme Court battles, you have all this battle over constitutional interpretation, because they believe that taken literally and contextually, it will support their vision. The political project of Christian nationalism, it's very hard to get your heads around, because it's not primarily about morality. We're so used to the culture war mentality, right? We say it's a fight about contraception, it's a fight about abortion, it's a fight about, homosexuality. It's not really about that. It's about the fact that in this vision, a society that tolerates these abominations, that tolerates evil, that tolerates sin, cannot be the godly kingdom, right? Will not allow the second coming of Christ to happen. So, we all sit here and say, well, to each to his own. I mean, if you don't want to have an abortion, fine, Godspeed, go, do what you want to do. No, that's not the way they're thinking. It's irrelevant
Right.
what you want. The tolerance of sin, the tolerance of evil. You heard that preacher in the thing that said there will be no more pluralism, there'll be no more toleration of evil. And so when you hear the evangelical leaders say things like the attack on 9/11 was God's retribution for the tolerance of homosexuality in this country, okay? And you can't get your head around that statement. They actually mean it. They mean it quite literally. And so the fight, in a real sense, is in their view about the toleration of evil. And to them, that is intolerable because it interrupts the process of having America become the godly kingdom and the second coming of Christ. And if you think they don't care about that, if you think you're passionate about things when you go into the voting booth, I mean, you got nothing on these people. The people that we all live in this filter bubble of the secular society of the East Coast and the big cities. We make the huge condescending mistake of thinking these people can't actually believe this. And that is one big mistake. Faith to them is a type of knowledge, and they are highly motivated. And so you can see why separation of church and state to them is anathema. Because in fact it's just the essence of America, right? Is its destiny to be the godly kingdom. So, what does that mean? The new orthodoxy is the separation of church and state is a myth, and they reinvented the history. And just if you think that this really is still on the fringes, in 2012, there was a Pew poll nationally. How many citizens in this country do you think answered the Pew poll and said they wished to see Christianity established, and they use that word, established, as the official religion of the country?
How many percent?
What percent of your fellow Americans in 2012?
30.
46.
70.
Boy, this is a lot of pessimists. Yeah, 32%. And I found 32% appalling. And people, but don't remember, this is the theocratic project. That is saying how many people want to see the American Constitution changed so that we become like Israel or someplace else where there is a state religion. There is no separation of church and state, where the essence of America is to be a Christian nation. 32%. Now, 32% is not 50%, but these numbers don't tell this. I mean, first of all, I'm sure you all know, how many people it took to elect, the Nazis in the 1932 election. I mean, revolutions are never majoritarian, ever. Revolutions always start with a determined, fanatical minority, and all they need is roughly about 30% of the people to go along with them to get what they want. In this country, 40%, 26 to 40% self-declare as born again or evangelical. Of those people, what do you think the voter turnout rate is?
90. Yeah.
85%. And what do you think it is for you? 50 in a good year. If it's a presidential year, 50. So just get your head around that for a second, all right? So that's 70 or 80 million people who self-declare as born again or evangelical. They turn out to vote at an 85% rate. And just do a little math. How many people, do you remember how many people it took to elect George Bush in 2004?
49%.
Took about 51 million votes. He got about 51 million votes to become. So, to the extent you were taking any comfort in that 32%, like it seemed small, don't. Now, the last, a lot of people at this point say, but hasn't this all changed? we were all worried about this in 2004 and 2005, and we were worried about it under Bush. But now we've had, Obama, and hasn't it all changed? I wish I could say it has, but in fact, it's gotten worse. In 2012, the first quarter of 2012, and let me say this, it's gotten worse in the states, at the state level. And that's something that is not visible to us. I don't know how many of you have read The Filter Bubble. Do you know what I mean by the filter bubble?
No.
There's a marvelous new book called The Filter Bubble. Now that it basically means we all get our information from sources that are designed to confirm our existing beliefs. Now, some of that is self-selecting, right? Okay, you choose to read the New York Times, you don't read the Wall Street Journal. You're not looking at Fox News. But it goes deeper than that. If we all opened our laptops right now and we logged on to, say, our Yahoo accounts, my page, and Yahoo News, my page and your page would be completely different. Because all the internet filters, they study who you are and they present the news that they think you want to hear. And this is the filter bubble. We're increasingly shrinking into this tight bubble of information and news that's designed to affirm our existing beliefs. So, when was the last time, you heard, about, the state of Oklahoma adopting, anti-blasphemy rules? You probably heard it in your AU email server, right? But other than that, you didn't read that in the New York Times, right? We live in the filter bubble. So what's happening in the States is incredible. In the first quarter of 2012, there were 944 bills introduced in the state legislatures to ban contraception and abortion. The anti-abortion bills now absolutely ignore Roe v. Wade. I mean, they used to be all tortured, to try to find a way. No, they just put it in to outlaw it. And the latest wave of state legislation are bills on blasphemy, criminalizing adultery, the establishment of Christianity as the official state religion, and of course we do tend to see the anti-gay marriage stuff. And it's interesting, Gary Wills, who's a very conservative guy, I don't know Gary Wills, he's a Catholic, kind of intellectual, somewhat right-wing. He called the 2012 election the great bait and switch. That all the Tea Party fervor got all these people who had genuine concern about the economy, budgets, deficits, right? So all these people ran on anti-deficit platforms. And what did they do when they got in the state legislature? They didn't do anything about the deficit. They just released this torrent of social culture war legislation. And the organization is incredible. Ralph Reed, who you remember led the Christian Coalition, his new group is called the Faith and Freedom Network. He's got 13 million emails, more than the entire Democratic Party. He obsessively studied Obama's 2008 election victory. The money that is going into new media and social networking to mobilize this base is incredible. So let me, and I think we want to have a conversation, but let me just end by talking a little bit. Why did I do this as a novel, right? I mean, we've been here talking about substance, right? Why did I do this as a novel? And there's a little history here. When Sarah Palin emerged as the candidate, I actually was one of the few people who had encountered her, who were in the lower 48, and I was so horrified. I was upset. I told my friends when McCain did what he did, I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I couldn't believe it. I felt the Republic was in peril in a way that it hadn't been since the Civil War. And I started reading everything I could about Sarah Palin, and I quickly started reading about her religious beliefs. And I knew nothing about, Dominionism and Reconstructionism and all this stuff, nothing. And I started reading these books, and there are about 4 or 5 books, and I bet the people in this room have read a lot of them. Michelle Goldberg wrote Kingdom Coming. Chris Hedges wrote American Fascists.
That's great.
Max Blumenthal, Chris Hedges wrote Family. Even the Republican, Kevin Phillips, wrote American Theocracy. So these, what I'm talking about, these are books by scholars and journalists, first-rate scholars and journalists. These books laid out everything I just told you tonight. Every page was a new horror. And I would go to, dinner parties and friends in New York, and I would say, and this is Manhattan, you think Manhattan, and I'd say, do you know this, do you know that? Everybody says, no. I said, well, have you read this, and this? No. So for whatever reason, even though nonfiction books have been written, terrific nonfiction books laying all of this out, for whatever reason, those books didn't click. And at the same time, I was reading a lot of cognitive and moral psychology. I don't know how many of you read Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, or The Happiness Hypothesis. It's amazing what advances we're making in understanding where our political and moral opinions come from. And to sum it up, they don't come from our frontal cortex and our rational facility, right? They come from our limbic brain, that old reptilian, highly evolved brain, which is acutely sensitive to empathy and community and alignment and identity, right? And so when you're out in Kansas and you say, well, Obama is not an American and global warming is a hoax, and right? If I stand up in front of that, like Al Gore stands up, with his PowerPoint slide, right? Has he ever changed the mind of one of those people? No. They didn't develop those opinions by the exercise of reason. They're not going to get away from them by the exercise of reason. They've become markers of identity. They become markers of community. They become a way of establishing empathy and relationship with the people around you. That's why they're so sticky. Those views are so sticky. If you take a step back, one of the things that addresses you at that level is art and literature and music, right? Because art and literature and music and stories don't talk to the frontal cortex, right? They talk to your humanity. They talk to your limbic brain. And so I got this idea, okay, nobody's read the nonfiction, so why don't I do it in fiction? And why don't I do it with characters that are like my average reader. So, I make this case that this is people we should worry about. When I give this book talk in New York, almost everybody's thinking, oh God, poor Fred has really lost it. Now he's obsessed with the religious crazies. They don't matter. What's he thinking? They're cranks. So what I have in the character, and I remember I told you it was a memoir, right? When he recounts what he was thinking, what's the first thing he says in the book? He says, well, this can't happen here. Right? All the characters, basically, they get your trust in this book because they say, these guys are nuts. We always had a lot of nuts in America, nothing to worry about. And even as, it gets worse and Sarah Palin does things and legislation is introduced, right? What are they all doing? They're all saying, well, it's going to stop here. They're not going to go any further, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So by using characters, by using stories, by using literature, I hopefully we can get kind of moderate people to take it seriously and really probe. And I have to say that the nicest thing, it doesn't sound very nice, but the thing that makes me happiest when people have read the book is they say, I was so upset for at least 3 days after I finished that book. I couldn't think of anything else. Right? And maybe that's not the way to sell books, but in terms of what my objectives were, it was really what I was going for, because the enemy here is complacency. It's complacency. And if the one thing that you get through this book, the book is about moral responsibility and personal responsibility. Every great public wrong in history has happened only because ordinary people did not get out of their chairs and speak up. And if you read Hannah Arendt, you look at the history of totalitarianism in the 20th century, the lesson is clear. All that bad stuff happened because ordinary good people were complacent, and they did not feel a sense of personal moral responsibility for what was happening in the public sphere. I think, I hope that my readers do. So that's So let's have a discussion. How do we do this? Should I just call on people?
Oh, yeah,
or?
go for it.
Good,
Yeah.
all right, this lady.
I actually had a question for you. So my observation of kind of the similar phenomenon which you were saying in 2000 is, you know, you're lumping it all into the Christian nation, but I see two groups of people here. I see the fundamentalists in the South who actually believe that, and then I see a group of opportunists in Washington, D.C. who realize you have a group of people who are willingly uneducated, not uneducated, but willingly narrow in their education, and they know another group of people who kind of want to keep their wealth in a wealth system, and these mostly uneducated people are also a large percentage of the poor people in the country. So they're like, if I can get these people to go with me, no one's going to go up against, you know, the larger wealth inequality issue because I've somehow gotten all the poor people to agree with me to keep my wealth. Even though, and they'll say, you know, the Christian things and stuff like that to get those people to go with them, but in actuality, they're just kind of more using them as a voter base.
Right, and you're
yeah.
so right. And one thing though that I can say that is somewhat encouraging is that when I said that Republicans, like the guy who blurred my book, realized that they did a deal with the devil. That's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
They did a deal. It was highly pragmatic, and a lot of those Republicans didn't believe in any of it.
Yeah.
And it got away from them.
Yeah.
It got away from them. I mean, look at Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I would say like your Mitt Romney,
He couldn't-
McCain to start off. You know,
Right, exactly. So it's an excellent point, and you're right. The right, broadly speaking, is in a tough place, and you're right. They don't all believe this, but they've been accommodationist. It's an excellent point. Yes, sir.
To further depress the audience, I can tell you that I was ready to move to Canada when McCain appointed Palin because McCain had melanoma 4 times.
Right.
I forgot he had a cerebral aneurysm.
Right.
But his chances, through my eyes, of living for 4 years was nil.
Right.
And so I thought for sure he was going to die. Right. And I thought we would die if that happened. So I just want you to know that his chances of dying were terrific. I don't know why he's still alive.
because he wasn't president.
Yes, sir.
So, okay, your message so far has been, you know, beware American totalitarianism. I'd like to sort of pin you closer to the wall on that. So, having studied this, what do you think the chances are, 100 being it would happen, that within the next 20 years we enter a fairly totalitarian state? And I leave you to define that. I think we understand. But secondly, what is the take-home message in terms of what people who believe in a separation of church and state and are against totalitarian, what should we do now? So those are the two things I want.
Pay your dues right now.
Well, to answer the second question first, if you look on the website, that's what the whole section says, what can you do? And you can do what all of you are doing right now, which is to come together with like-minded people, provide whatever support you can, whether it's financial or simply driving around and talking. You know, the biggest enemy is silence. It's interesting. You people don't talk about. Maybe you do, but people don't talk about this stuff. And just talking about it is huge. Now, the first question is very hard. The number is under 50. That I can say for sure. But one of the things that comes clear in this book is my view of how history happens. History happens a combination of error and bad luck. And to generally have a catastrophe, you have to have both. You have to have both bad people and complacency and all the things, and then you have to have some other external bad luck. So, if the economy does okay, if we don't have another terrorist attack, if we don't, if we don't have a foreign policy crisis, and if and the demographics keep going the way they're going, i.e., the country's getting younger, immigrants, even though many Latino immigrants are socially quite conservative, they're certainly not in this theocratic, this particular brand of